When I saw my stepfather Raymond's eyes lock onto mine that summer evening in 1962 and heard him whisper to my uncle Marcus, "She's getting older now. Time we taught her some real lessons," I knew my childhood innocence was about to be shattered, forever in ways no 8-year-old should ever experience. Hello, my precious viewers. This is Grandma Rose, 73 years young, sitting here in my cozy living room in Asheville, North Carolina, with the Blue Ridge Mountains painting the most beautiful backdrop you could imagine. The autumn leaves are just starting to turn, and there's something about this season of change that's given me the courage to finally share a story I've carried in my heart for over 6 decades. My grandchildren, all adults now with families of their own, have been telling me for years that my story needs to be heard. Grandma Rose, my oldest granddaughter Sarah, always says, "What you survived and how you turned it into strength could help so many people." So here I am, with my favorite lavender tea steaming beside me and my old quilt wrapped around my shoulders, finally ready to open these locked chambers of memory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Before I begin this journey with you, I want you to know that this isn't just my story. It's a story for every person who has ever felt powerless, who has ever wondered if they could survive their darkest moments, who has ever questioned whether healing is truly possible. If that's you, I want you to know that you're not alone, and more importantly, you're stronger than you realize. I was born Rose Eleanor Patterson in the spring of 1951 in a small town called Millfield, nestled in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania. Back then, Millfield was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where children played safely in the streets until the streetlights came on, and where families gathered on front porches every evening to watch the world go by. The main street had Peterson's General Store, Murphy's Diner, and the old Millfield Bank with its grand marble columns that made it look like a courthouse. My earliest memories are painted in golden hues of pure happiness. My father, William Patterson, was a gentle giant of a man who worked as a foreman at the local lumber mill. He had these enormous hands, rough from years of hard work, but they were the gentlest hands in the world when he braided my hair each morning or tucked me into bed with stories about brave princesses who saved kingdoms. His laugh was deep and warm, the kind that made you feel safe just hearing it echo through our little white house on Maple Street. My mother, Catherine, was the town librarian, a woman who believed books could cure any ailment of the heart or mind. She had auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper, and she always smelled of vanilla and old paper. Every evening after dinner, she would read to me from classic fairy tales, but she had this wonderful way of changing the endings so that the princesses always saved themselves. "Remember, Rosie," she would say, using my childhood nickname, "you don't need anyone else to rescue you. You have everything you need right here." And she would tap gently over my heart. Our house was small but filled with love. The kitchen always had fresh flowers from Mother's garden, and the living room had this old piano that my mother would play while my father sang in his slightly off-key but enthusiastic voice. I learned to play simple melodies, and some of my happiest memories are of the 3 of us gathered around that piano on Sunday afternoons, making music that was imperfect but beautiful. Life was simple then, predictable in the most wonderful way. Father would leave for work at dawn. Mother would walk me to kindergarten before heading to the library, and I would spend my days learning letters and numbers, making friends with other children whose biggest worry was whether they would get chocolate or vanilla ice cream after school. We lived modestly, but never felt poor because we were rich in the things that truly mattered. The change began slowly, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. My father started coming home later from the mill, often with a slight tremor in his hands that he tried to hide. Mother would ask him about his day, and he would give shorter and shorter answers, sometimes just grunting and heading straight to wash up. The laughter that used to fill our house became rarer, replaced by hushed conversations between my parents that would stop abruptly whenever I entered the room. I was too young to understand what words like layoffs and company downsizing meant, but I could feel the tension growing in our home like a living thing. My parents tried to shield me from their worries, but children sense these things. The bedtime stories became shorter, the piano sessions less frequent, and sometimes I would catch my mother staring out the window with tears in her eyes that she would quickly wipe away when she noticed me watching. The devastating blow came on a cold Tuesday in February when I was 6 years old. My father collapsed at the lumber mill. The official cause was a massive heart attack, but I later learned that the stress of potentially losing his job, combined with his desperate attempts to work longer hours to prove his value to the company, had literally broken his heart. He was only 32 years old. I remember the funeral in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror. The church was packed with people from all over Millfield, testimony to how beloved my father was in our community. My mother sat rigid beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly it almost hurt, as if she was afraid I might disappear too. I kept expecting my father to walk through those church doors and tell everyone this was all a terrible mistake, that he was fine and ready to come home to braid my hair and sing our silly songs. But he never came home. The months following my father's death were the loneliest of my young life. My mother, drowning in her own grief, struggled to maintain any semblance of normalcy. She would often sit in his old armchair for hours, still wearing her library clothes, staring at nothing. The flowers in her garden withered and died, the piano gathered dust, and our once warm home became a tomb of memories. Money became a constant worry. My father's life insurance was modest, and a librarian's salary in a small town barely covered our basic needs. I watched my mother count and recount the bills each night at the kitchen table, her face growing more drawn with each passing week. She started taking on extra work, cleaning houses and doing laundry for other families, which meant longer days away from home and even less time for the mother-daughter moments I desperately craved. It was during this vulnerable time that Raymond Mitchell entered our lives. Raymond was my mother's second cousin, a man in his late 30s who had never married and worked as a traveling salesman for farm equipment. He was tall and lean, with slicked-back dark hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. When he heard about my father's death through family channels, he appeared at our door one evening in early fall, claiming he wanted to help family in their time of need. "Catherine," he said to my mother in a voice that was smooth as honey, "Billy was a good man, and you shouldn't have to struggle alone. I've got some money saved up, and little Rose here needs a father figure. Let me help you get back on your feet." My mother, exhausted from months of financial stress and emotional turmoil, saw Raymond as an answer to her prayers. Here was a man offering stability, companionship, and most importantly, financial security. Within 3 months of my father's death, Raymond had moved into our house on Maple Street, bringing with him his few possessions, and what I would later realize was a carefully constructed facade of respectability. At first, Raymond seemed like the solution to all our problems. He paid the overdue bills, brought groceries home regularly, and even bought me new clothes and shoes. To the outside world, and especially to my mother, he appeared to be a godsend. He was charming at church services, helpful to neighbors, and always quick with a joke or compliment when other adults were around. But children see things that adults miss, and from the very beginning, something about Raymond made my skin crawl. It was the way his eyes would follow me when he thought no one was looking, the way his hand would linger just a moment too long when he helped me with my coat, the way he would find excuses to be alone with me when my mother was at work or running errands. 6 months after Raymond moved in, my mother made the decision that would seal my fate. Grateful for his support and believing she had found love again, Catherine Patterson became Catherine Mitchell in a small ceremony at the Millfield Community Church. I was 7 years old, wearing a pale yellow dress that Raymond had bought for me. standing beside them as they exchanged vows and promised to love and protect each other and me. That night, as I lay in my bed listening to the sounds of celebration from downstairs where a few neighbors had gathered for cake and coffee, I had no idea that my real nightmare was just beginning. I had no way of knowing that the man my mother had just married, the man who was now legally my stepfather, had been planning this moment from the day he first knocked on our door. And I certainly had no idea that Raymond's brother Marcus, who lived just 2 towns over in Riverside, was about to become a regular visitor to our home, bringing with him an evil that would shatter what remained of my childhood innocence and set me on a path of survival that would test every ounce of strength I didn't even know I possessed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Like a skilled predator, Raymond knew that sudden changes would raise suspicions. So he implemented his control gradually, methodically, over the course of several months following his marriage to my mother. It started with small things that seemed almost reasonable. He convinced my mother that I was getting too old to sleep with my bedroom door open, so a lock was installed, on the outside. For her own safety, he explained when Catherine questioned it. Children can sleepwalk, and we wouldn't want little Rose wandering around at night and getting hurt. My mother, trusting her new husband's judgment about child-rearing, agreed without argument. Next came the isolation from friends. Whenever I asked to play with Susan Miller or Jenny Thompson from school, Raymond would find reasons why it wasn't a good idea. Rose needs to focus on her studies more, he'd tell my mother. These other children are distracting her from becoming the bright young lady she could be. Gradually, the invitations stopped coming, and my world shrank to just our house on Maple Street and the increasingly uncomfortable presence of my stepfather. Raymond also began inserting himself into every aspect of my daily routine. He insisted on walking me to and from school, claiming it was for my protection, but I noticed how his hand would rest on my shoulder in a way that made my skin crawl. He volunteered to help me with homework, sitting uncomfortably close at the kitchen table, his breath hot against my neck as he leaned over to check my arithmetic. When I would instinctively pull away, he would chuckle and say, "Don't be shy, Rose. I'm your father now, and fathers help their daughters." But it was the bath time routine that first crossed the line into something I knew was deeply wrong, even at 7 years old. One evening in late spring, about 4 months after the Gila wedding, my mother was working late at the library for their annual book inventory. Raymond knocked on the bathroom door while I was getting ready for my bath. "Rose, honey?" His voice was different somehow, softer, but with an edge that made my stomach twist. "Your mother asked me to make sure you get properly clean. You're getting to be a big girl now, and big girls need to learn proper hygiene." I told him through the door that I could bathe myself, that I'd been doing it for months since Mama got so busy with work, but he insisted, saying that my mother had specifically asked him to help, and that good daughters listen to their fathers. When I continued to resist, his tone shifted to something colder, more threatening. "Rose Eleanor Mitchell," he said, using my full name with his surname in a way that reminded me of my powerless position in this new family structure. "I won't ask again. Open this door right now, or you'll be in serious trouble with your mother when she gets home." The fear of disappointing my already fragile mother, combined with my 7-year-old understanding of adult authority, made me unlock the door. What happened next is burned into my memory like a brand. Raymond entered the bathroom with a washcloth and soap, his eyes taking in my small, vulnerable body in a way that made me want to disappear. His hands, rough and invasive, touched me in places that made me feel sick and confused. "This is just between us, Rose," he whispered as I stood there shaking, tears streaming down my face. "This is what fathers do to take care of their daughters. But other people might not understand our special relationship, so this has to be our secret. If you tell anyone, even your mother, it would break her heart. She's been through so much already, losing your real father. Do you want to hurt your mother even more? The manipulation was perfect and devastating. He had weaponized my love for my mother and my guilt over my father's death against me. At 7 years old, I didn't have the emotional tools to recognize this as abuse. I only knew that I felt dirty, confused, and terrifyingly alone. This became our new routine whenever my mother worked late or went to run errands. Raymond would find excuses to help me with baths, getting dressed, or checking if I was properly clean before bed. Each time, his touches became more invasive, more lingering, and his whispered reminders about keeping our special secret became more threatening. The worst part was how he maintained his perfect stepfather facade in front of my mother. He would bring me little gifts, a hair ribbon, a candy bar, a small toy, always presented in front of Catherine as evidence of his caring nature. "Look how much your new daddy loves you, Rose," my mother would say, her eyes bright with relief and gratitude. Aren't we lucky to have Raymond in our lives? I wanted desperately to tell her the truth, but Raymond's psychological manipulation was masterful. He had convinced me that revealing our secret would destroy my mother, who was just beginning to smile again after months of grief. He also made it clear that no one would believe me over him. After all, he was the respectable adult who had saved us from poverty and loneliness. My behavior at school began to change dramatically. I became withdrawn and jumpy, my grades dropped, and I started having what my teacher, Mrs. Anderson, called attention problems. When she asked if everything was all right at home, I would just nod and say that my new stepfather was very nice. How could I explain that the man everyone praised as my savior was the source of my nightmares? It was during this dark period that Raymond first mentioned his brother Marcus. "My brother's coming to visit next month," he announced one evening, over dinner. "He's excited to meet my new family. Marcus has always been great with children. He used to coach Little League back in Riverside before he hurt his back." The way Raymond's eyes glinted when he talked about Marcus made my blood run cold. There was something in his expression, a shared understanding or anticipation that I couldn't quite name but instinctively feared. When my mother asked about Marcus's visit, Raymond was vague about the details, saying only that his brother needed a place to stay for a while and that it would be good for me to have another positive male influence in my life. "Rose needs to learn how to interact properly with men," Raymond explained to my mother. "She's been too sheltered, and Marcus can help teach her some important life lessons." The dread that settled in my stomach at those words was so intense I could barely eat my dinner. Something in Raymond's tone, combined with the knowing look in his eyes, told me that Marcus's visit would bring new horrors I wasn't prepared to face. As summer approached and my 8th birthday drew near, the abuse escalated. Raymond became bolder, more demanding, and his threats more explicit. He told me about other little girls who hadn't kept their family secrets, girls who had ended up in terrible places because they couldn't be trusted. He described foster homes where children were beaten and starved, painting vivid pictures of what would happen to me if I broke up our happy family with my lies. "Your mother would never forgive you," he would whisper after each violation. "She's so happy now, finally moving on from your father's death. If you ruin this for her, if you take away her happiness again, it would kill her. Is that what you want, Rose? Do you want to be responsible for your mother's death too?" The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical abuse. Raymond had turned my love for my mother into a weapon against me, making me complicit in my own victimization. He had convinced me that protecting myself would mean destroying the only parent I had left. As June arrived and Marcus's visit approached, I found myself praying to a God I wasn't sure was listening anymore. I prayed for strength, for protection, for someone to notice that something was terribly wrong. But my prayers seemed to echo in an empty universe, and each day brought me closer to a nightmare that would soon involve not one predator, but two. The night before Marcus arrived, Raymond came to my room after my mother had gone to sleep. He sat on the edge of my bed, his weight making the mattress dip uncomfortably, and ran his fingers through my hair in a way that made my skin crawl. "Tomorrow you're going to meet Uncle Marcus," he said softly, his voice carrying that same threatening undertone I'd come to dread. "He's going to love you just as much as I do. And you're going to be a good girl for both of us, aren't you, Rose? You're going to remember that families take care of each other, and that means keeping family secrets safe." As I lay there in the darkness after he left, listening to the house settle around me, I had no idea that the worst was yet to come. I couldn't imagine that the horror I was already living could get worse, that two men could work together to systematically destroy what remained of my childhood innocence. But I was about to learn that evil, when it finds a partner, becomes exponentially more dangerous. And Uncle Marcus, as I would discover the very next day, was the perfect partner for Raymond's sick games. Marcus Mitchell arrived on a sweltering Saturday morning in June 1959, driving up to our house in a battered green pickup truck that belched black smoke and rattled like a collection of loose screws. I watched from my bedroom window as he climbed out of the driver's seat, a man who looked like a rougher, more dangerous version of Raymond. Where my stepfather was lean and calculating, Marcus was thick and brutish, with massive forearms covered in faded tattoos and a permanent scowl that suggested violence was never far from the surface. He was shorter than Raymond, but built like a bull, with graying brown hair that hung in greasy strands and small dark eyes that seemed to take inventory of everything around him as potential prey. When he spotted me watching from the window, he smiled and waved, but there was nothing warm or friendly in the gesture. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted his next meal. "Rose, come down and meet your Uncle Marcus," Raymond called. From the front porch, his voice carrying that fake cheerfulness he always used when other adults might be listening. My mother stood beside him, wiping her hands on her apron and smiling with genuine warmth. She had spent the entire morning cleaning the house and preparing a special lunch, excited to meet Raymond's family and create new bonds for our reconstructed household. When I reluctantly came downstairs, Marcus engulfed me in what appeared to be a bear hug, but felt more like being trapped in the grip of something wild and dangerous. His clothes smelled of cigarettes, motor oil, and something sour that made my stomach turn. His hands, rough and calloused, lingered on my back and shoulders longer than any normal embrace should last. "Well, well," he said in a gravelly voice. That sounded like he'd been shouting or smoking for decades. "Aren't you a pretty little thing? Raymond told me you were special, but he didn't tell me just how special." The way he emphasized that word made my skin crawl, and I caught the meaningful look that passed between the two brothers. My mother, oblivious to the undercurrents of menace, beamed at what she perceived as familial affection. "Rose, isn't it wonderful to have more family? Uncle Marcus is going to stay with us for a while until he finds a new place to live." What I didn't know then, but would learn years later, was that Marcus hadn't lost his home or his job. He had been forced to leave Riverside after too many complaints from neighbors about his inappropriate interest in the children on his street. The Little League coaching position Raymond had mentioned? That had ended abruptly when parents started asking uncomfortable questions about private training sessions and overnight camping trips. Marcus had come to Millfield not because he needed a place to stay, but because Raymond had invited him to share in his new acquisition. My stepfather had been boasting to his brother about his perfect setup, a vulnerable widow grateful for protection, and a young stepdaughter who was already trained to keep family secrets. The first few days of Marcus's visit seemed almost normal, at least during daylight hours when my mother was around. The brothers would sit on the front porch, drinking beer and talking about their childhood, while I played quietly in the yard, always within sight, but trying to stay as far away as possible. Marcus was charming with my mother, complimenting her cooking and helping with household repairs that Raymond had been putting off. He even fixed our squeaky screen door and painted the front steps, earning grateful praise from Catherine. But at night, when my mother was asleep, the real nature of Marcus's visit revealed itself. It started on his third night in our house. I was lying in bed, trying to read one of the books my mother had brought home from the library, when I heard the distinctive sound of my bedroom door lock turning. My blood turned to ice. Raymond always made a point of locking me in at night, claiming it was for my own safety, but I had never heard the lock being opened after bedtime. The door creaked open slowly, and both Raymond and Marcus slipped into my room like shadows. In the dim light from the hallway, I could see they were both wearing only their undershirts and boxer shorts, and the predatory expressions on their faces made it clear this was a planned encounter. "Now, Rose," Raymond whispered, settling on one side of my bed while Marcus took the other. "Uncle Marcus has been very patient, waiting to get to know you better. But he's family now, just like me, and families share everything with each other." What happened next was a systematic violation that went far beyond anything Raymond had done to me alone. The two men worked together with a coordination that suggested they had done this before, with other children, in other places. They took turns holding me down while the other committed acts that no child should ever experience. When I tried to cry out, Marcus clamped his massive hand over my mouth while Raymond whispered threats about what would happen if I made any noise. "Your mom is sleeping right down the hall," Marcus growled in my ear, his breath hot and nauseating. "One sound from you, and we'll have to explain to her why you're being such a bad girl. You wouldn't want to disappoint her, would you?" The physical pain was excruciating, but the psychological torture was worse. They had turned my bedroom, the one place that should have been safe, into a chamber of horrors. They violated not just my body, but my sense of security, my trust in the concept of family, my belief that adults were supposed to protect children. When they finally left, sometime near dawn, I lay there broken and bleeding, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how the world could contain such evil. The worst part was knowing they would be back, that this wasn't a one-time nightmare, but the beginning of a new routine that would continue for as long as Marcus stayed in our house. The next morning at breakfast, both men acted as if nothing had happened. Marcus complimented my mother's pancakes and asked about my plans for summer vacation. Raymond discussed his work schedule and mentioned that he might need to travel more for his sales job, leaving Marcus to help look after me and my mother. The casual normalcy of their behavior, contrasted with the horror of what they had done just hours before, made me feel like I was going insane. My mother noticed that I was quiet and picking at my food, but when she asked if I felt all right, Raymond quickly interjected. "Rose was having some bad dreams last night," he said smoothly. "She's been having trouble sleeping since she's getting to be such a big girl. Growing up is hard, isn't it, sweetheart?" I nodded mutely, unable to find words to describe my reality. How could I explain that my nightmares were real, that they were sitting at our breakfast table planning my next violation over coffee and orange juice? As the days passed, the abuse became more frequent and more brutal. The brothers seemed to feed off each other's depravity, each trying to outdo the other in their cruelty. They developed a system where one would serve as lookout while the other attacked me. Then they would switch roles. They invaded my room at different times, during my mother's grocery shopping trips, when she was working late at the library, during her afternoon naps when the summer heat made her drowsy. Marcus brought a new dimension of terror to the abuse. Where Raymond was calculated and methodical, Marcus was unpredictable and violent. He seemed to enjoy my fear as much as the physical violations, often threatening me with even worse consequences if I didn't cooperate enthusiastically enough for his tastes. "You better start acting like you enjoy this," he would snarl, "or I'll have to teach you some real lessons about gratitude." They also began photographing their crimes, using an old Polaroid camera that Marcus had brought with him. The photos, they explained, were insurance policies. Evidence that would destroy my mother and ruin my reputation if I ever tried to tell anyone what was happening. Who's going to believe a dirty little girl who poses for pictures like these? Raymond would ask, waving the developing photos in front of my face. Everyone will think you're just as sick as we are. The isolation became complete. I stopped playing outside, stopped reading, stopped doing anything that might be interpreted as normal childhood behavior. I became a ghost in my own life, existing only to survive from one assault to the next. My mother noticed the change but attributed it to typical childhood phases and the adjustment to having Marcus in the house. Rose has always been sensitive, she would tell Marcus when he fake expressed concern about my withdrawn behavior. She'll come around once she gets used to having more family. But I wasn't going to come around. I was dying inside, piece by piece, violation by violation. The bright, curious little girl who had once loved books and piano music was disappearing, replaced by a hollow shell who existed only to endure. As summer wore on and Marcus showed no signs of leaving, I began to understand that this was my new reality. There would be no rescue, no escape, no end to the nightmare. I was trapped in a house with two predators who had unlimited access to me and the perfect cover of family respectability. What I didn't know was that salvation would eventually come from the most unexpected source, and that my journey towards freedom would begin with an act of desperate courage that even I didn't know I possessed. The breaking point came on a humid Thursday afternoon in late July, almost 6 weeks after Marcus had arrived to make our house his hunting ground. My mother had gone to Pittsburgh for a library conference, leaving me alone with both predators for 3 entire days. It was the longest I had ever been left without any protection, however unknowing that protection had been. That morning, Raymond had announced he was taking Marcus fishing at Miller's Creek, about an hour's drive from Millfield. "We'll be gone most of the day," he told me with that false cheerfulness he used when neighbors might be listening. "You be a good girl and stay in the house. Don't answer the door for anyone." I felt a flood of relief so intense it made me dizzy. A whole day without fear, without having to calculate where they were and whether I was safe to move freely through my own home. I spent the morning doing simple things that had become luxuries, reading a book in the living room with all the curtains open, playing a few songs on my mother's piano, even taking a bath without terror. But around 2 in the afternoon, I heard the familiar rattle of Marcus's pickup truck pulling into our driveway. My heart immediately began racing as I peered through the front window and saw both men getting out of the truck, their fishing gear still in the back. They were talking animatedly about something, gesturing toward the house in a way that made my stomach clench with dread. "Rose!" Raymond called as they entered through the front door. "We're back early." The fish weren't biting, so we decided to come home and spend some quality time with our favorite girl. The way he said "quality time" made my blood turn to ice. I recognized that tone, that particular combination of false affection and underlying threat. They had planned this, I realized. The fishing trip had been a ruse, a way to make my mother think they would be gone all day while they actually returned to have unlimited access to me. I tried to run upstairs to my room, thinking I could lock myself in the bathroom, but Marcus caught me at the bottom of the staircase. His massive hands wrapped around my waist, lifting me as if I weighed nothing, while Raymond locked the front door and drew all the curtains closed. "Where are you going in such a hurry, little Rose?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying that gravelly menace I had come to dread. "Don't you want to spend time with your family?" They carried me to the living room, where our family piano sat in the corner like a monument to happier times. What happened next was the most brutal assault yet, conducted in broad daylight in the room where my parents had once made music together. They seemed to take special pleasure in violating me in this space that held my most precious memories, as if they were determined to destroy every safe haven in my mind. But this time, something was different. This time, we had a witness. Mrs. Eleanor Hendricks lived in the house directly across the street from us. She was a widow in her 70s, a former school teacher who had known my father since he was a boy. Since my mother's remarriage, Mrs. Hendricks had made several attempts to maintain contact with me, but Raymond always found polite ways to discourage her visits. "Rose is very busy with her studies," he would tell her. "We don't want her to fall behind in school." What we didn't know was that Mrs. Hendricks had been growing increasingly concerned about the changes in my behavior. As a retired teacher with 40 years of experience, she had developed an instinct for recognizing children in distress. She had noticed how I had become withdrawn and fearful, how I no longer played in the yard or waved when she worked in her garden, how I seemed to shrink into myself whenever Raymond or Marcus were around. On this particular afternoon, Mrs. Hendricks had been weeding her flower bed when she saw the men return unexpectedly from their fishing trip. Something about their hasty entrance into the house, followed by the immediate closing of all the curtains, struck her as odd. When she heard what sounded like crying or distress coming from our house, her teacher's instincts kicked into high gear. Mrs. Hendricks did something that may have saved my life. She quietly walked across the street and positioned herself beneath our living room window, which faced her house. The window was open due to the summer heat, and despite the drawn curtains, sound carried clearly to where she stood, hidden by my mother's overgrown rose bushes. What she heard made her blood run cold. She heard my muffled cries and desperate pleas. She heard Raymond's voice instructing Marcus on positioning and technique. She heard Marcus's crude commentary about my body and his plans for teaching me new tricks. Most damning of all, she heard them discussing the photographs they were taking and how they planned to use them to ensure my continued silence. Mrs. Hendricks, despite her age and the shocking nature of what she was witnessing, had the presence of mind to remain calm and gather evidence. She listened for nearly 20 minutes, memorizing details and quotes that would later prove crucial. When she heard them discussing plans to really break her in good over the next few days while my mother was away, she knew she had to act immediately. But Mrs. Hendricks was also smart enough to know that going to the local police might not be effective. Millfield was a small town where everyone knew everyone, and Raymond had cultivated relationships with several officers through his work. She had also heard enough of their conversation to understand that they had blackmail material that they would use to discredit me if anyone tried to help. Instead, she did something brilliant. She called her nephew Robert, who worked as a detective with the Pennsylvania State Police in Harrisburg. Robert Hendricks was a seasoned investigator who specialized in crimes against children, and when his aunt called him with her horrific account, he immediately understood the urgency of the situation. "Aunt Eleanor," he said, "I need you to call the sheriff's office in the next county and tell them you have an emergency situation involving child abuse. Don't call local police. These men might have connections there. Tell them a state detective is en route and to secure the scene immediately." Within an hour, 2 sheriff's deputies from Jefferson County arrived at our house while I was still trapped inside with Raymond and Marcus. The men had finished their assault and were in the kitchen, drinking beer and planning their activities for the evening. When the authoritative knocking came at the front door, followed by voices identifying themselves as law enforcement, both men went into immediate panic mode. "What the hell?" Raymond hissed, peering through the curtains at the police cars in our driveway. "Who could have called them?" Marcus's reaction was more violent and telling. "I told you this town was too small," he snarled. "We should have been more careful. If that little bitch said something—" "She didn't say anything," Raymond insisted, but I could hear the fear in his voice. "She knows what would happen to her mother if she talked." The deputies were persistent, and their voices carried the authority of men who would not be turned away with excuses. "We need to speak with all residents of this household immediately," one of them called. "We have reports of a disturbance." As Raymond and Marcus whispered frantically about what to do, I made a decision that surprised even myself. Despite months of conditioning to remain silent, despite the photographs and threats, despite my terror of what might happen to my mother, I ran to the front door and unlocked it before either man could stop me. "Help me," I said to the first deputy I saw, a tall man with kind eyes and graying hair. "Please help me. The scene that followed was chaos. Marcus tried to run out the back door but was tackled by the second deputy. Raymond attempted to destroy evidence, frantically gathering the Polaroid photographs, but Detective Robert Hendricks had arrived just in time to prevent it. The photos were seized, along with the camera and several other pieces of evidence that would later prove crucial in building the case against both men. But the most important evidence was the testimony of Mrs. Hendricks, who had witnessed enough of their crimes to provide detailed, credible testimony that no amount of manipulation or victim blaming could overcome. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket and being examined by a gentle paramedic, I watched Raymond and Marcus being loaded into separate police cars and handcuffs. For the first time in almost a year, I felt something I had forgotten existed: hope. Mrs. Hendricks approached the ambulance and took my hand in her wrinkled, soft fingers. "You're safe now, dear," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry it took so long for someone to see. But you're safe now, and those men will never hurt you again." What I didn't know then was that my nightmare was ending, but my journey toward healing was just beginning. The legal battle ahead would be difficult, and there would be many people who would question my story or blame me for what had happened. But I also didn't know that I had found in Mrs. Hendricks not just a savior, but a fierce advocate who would stand by me through every challenge that lay ahead. The hospital room where I spent the next 3 days was the first truly safe space I had experienced in almost a year. The walls were clean and white, the nurses spoke in gentle voices, and most importantly, there were locks on the doors that only I could control from the inside. Dr. Sarah Matthews, a pediatrician who specialized in treating abused children, became my first real advocate in the medical system. "Rose," she said during our first conversation, sitting in a chair beside my bed rather than towering over me like most adults did, "what happened to you was not your fault. I need you to understand that, even if you don't believe it right now. Adults are supposed to protect children, not hurt them. Raymond and Marcus broke that sacred trust, and they will face consequences for their actions." The physical examination had revealed extensive evidence of long-term sexual abuse. Dr. Matthews documented every injury, every scar, every indication of trauma with the meticulous care of someone who understood that her medical records might be the difference between justice and impunity. She also arranged for a counselor, Mrs. Patricia Wilkes, to begin working with me immediately. Mrs. Wilkes was unlike anyone I had ever met. She was a survivor herself, though I wouldn't learn the details of her own childhood until much later. She had an uncanny ability to understand exactly what I was feeling without me having to explain it. During our first session, she didn't ask me to talk about what had happened. Instead, she handed me a box of crayons and a large sheet of paper. "Sometimes," she said, "our feelings are too big for words. Would you like to draw me a picture of how you feel right now?" I drew a small figure trapped inside a dark house with 2 large, menacing shadows looming over her. Outside the house, I drew a bright yellow sun that couldn't reach inside. Mrs. Wilkes studied the drawing carefully, then nodded as if it made perfect sense to her. "The sun is still there," she observed. "Even when you can't feel its warmth, it's still shining. We just need to find a way to break down the walls that are keeping it from reaching you." But while I was beginning the long process of healing in the safety of the hospital, a different kind of storm was brewing at home. My mother had been contacted immediately after my rescue and had rushed back from Pittsburgh in a state of shock and denial that would define her response to the entire crisis. Catherine Mitchell, she had legally taken Raymond's name, arrived at the hospital on Friday evening, nearly 24 hours after the arrests. When she walked into my room, I saw a woman I barely recognized. Her usually neat hair was disheveled, her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she moved like someone who had been physically struck by lightning. "Oh, my baby," she whispered, collapsing into the chair beside my bed and reaching for my hand. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't here to protect you." For a moment, I felt hope. Maybe my mother would believe me. Maybe she would understand that I had been trying to protect her by keeping the terrible secret. Maybe we could rebuild our relationship and heal together. But then she spoke again, and I realized how naive my hopes had been. "The police are saying such terrible things about Raymond," she continued, her voice breaking. "They're saying he and Marcus, that they—" She couldn't even say the words. "But Rose, honey, you know how much Raymond loves us. He saved us when your father died. He gave us a home, security, a future. There must be some explanation. Maybe you misunderstood what was happening. Maybe you had bad dreams that seemed real." The crushing weight of her denial hit me like a physical blow. Even faced with medical evidence, police reports, and eyewitness testimony, my mother was choosing to protect her version of reality rather than face the truth about what had been happening to her daughter. Dr. Matthews, who had been present during this conversation, intervened gently but firmly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand. This is devastating news for you. But Rose has been severely traumatized, and she needs your support and belief right now. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable." My mother's response revealed the depth of her psychological dependence on Raymond. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "Before Raymond, we had nothing. I was drowning in debt, working 3 jobs, watching my daughter go without basic necessities. He gave us stability. He gave us love. Rose has always been an imaginative child. Maybe she's confused." "Mama," I whispered, the word coming out like a plea. "It really happened. He hurt me. They both hurt me. I tried to tell you without words. I tried to show you I was scared. But Catherine was too deep in her denial to hear me." Over the next several days, as the legal proceedings began and more evidence came to light, her position only hardened. She hired a lawyer not to support my case against Raymond and Marcus, but to defend Raymond against what she insisted were false accusations. The betrayal was almost worse than the original abuse. Raymond and Marcus had stolen my childhood and my sense of safety. But my mother's refusal to believe me stole something even more fundamental: my faith in the possibility of unconditional love. Detective Robert Hendricks became a regular presence during those hospital days, carefully building the case against both men while trying to shield me from the worst aspects of the legal process. He explained that the photographs alone would be enough to convict them, but my testimony would be crucial for ensuring they received the longest possible sentences. "Rose," he said during one of our conversations, "I know this is scary, but you're incredibly brave. What you did when you opened that door took more courage than most adults have. Because of your bravery, we're going to make sure these men never hurt another child." The preliminary hearings began while I was still in the hospital. Both Raymond and Marcus had been denied bail. The evidence was too overwhelming, and the risk of flight too high. Through Detective Hendricks, I learned that this was not their first offense. Marcus had a record of suspected child abuse in 3 different states, and Raymond had been investigated twice before for inappropriate relationships with underage girls, though charges had never been filed due to lack of evidence. "They're predators," Detective Hendricks explained to me in terms I could understand. "They seek out vulnerable families and exploit them. What happened to you wasn't random, Rose. They chose our family specifically because your mother was alone and grateful for help." Mrs. Hendricks visited me every day, bringing books, puzzles, and most importantly, unwavering support. She had become my unofficial guardian, working with social services to ensure I had advocates who truly understood the situation. When it became clear that my mother was not going to provide the support I needed, Mrs. Hendricks stepped into that role without hesitation. "Dear," she told me one afternoon as we worked on a jigsaw puzzle together, "sometimes the people who are supposed to love us most are too broken themselves to do the right thing. That doesn't mean you're unlovable. It means they're too scared to face a truth that would shatter their world." Social services became involved immediately. conducting their own investigation and evaluation. Mrs. Jennifer Barnes, my caseworker, was a no-nonsense woman who had seen too many cases like mine to have any illusions about family dynamics in abuse situations. Rose will not be returning to her mother's custody until Mrs. Mitchell demonstrates that she can prioritize her daughter's safety over her relationship with the perpetrator, she announced after her initial assessment. Right now, Mrs. Mitchell poses a risk to Rose's emotional recovery because she continues to deny the reality of what occurred. This decision sent my mother into a complete breakdown. She accused social services of tearing apart families, accused me of lying to get attention, and even accused Mrs. Hendricks of manipulating the situation for reasons she couldn't articulate. The woman who had once read me fairy tales and played piano with me had become a stranger, consumed by a delusion she couldn't afford to abandon. The temporary custody arrangement placed me in the care of Mrs. Hendricks, who had volunteered to serve as my foster parent during the legal proceedings. Moving into her house across the street from my childhood home was surreal. I could see my old bedroom window from her guest room, but the distance felt like crossing into an entirely different universe. Mrs. Hendricks's house was everything mine had stopped being after my father's death. It was warm, safe, filled with books and music, and the smell of homemade cookies. She had grandchildren who visited regularly, and for the first time in months, I heard the sound of children's laughter without fearing what might follow. "This is your home for as long as you need it," she told me on my first night there, tucking me into a bed with clean sheets and a soft quilt her grandmother had made. "You're not a burden. You're not temporary. And you're not going anywhere until you're ready and safe." As I lay in that comfortable bed, looking out the window at the house where my nightmare had taken place, I realized that my story was far from over. The worst was behind me, but the work of rebuilding my life, seeking justice, and learning to trust again was just beginning. And somewhere across the street, in the house that had once been my home, my mother was making choices that would determine whether we would ever have a relationship again. The courthouse in Jefferson County was an imposing brick building that seemed designed to intimidate everyone who entered its halls. When I walked up those stone steps on the morning of September 15th, 1959, holding tightly to Mrs. Hendricks's hand, I was 8 years old and about to testify against 2 grown men who had terrorized me for months. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than my small shoulders could bear. District Attorney Michael O'Connor had prepared me extensively for this moment. He was a kind man with graying temples and a gentle manner that put children at ease, but he was also a fierce prosecutor who had built his career on protecting the vulnerable. During our practice sessions, he had explained exactly what would happen in the courtroom and what questions I might face. "Rose," he had told me during our final preparation meeting, "the defense attorneys are going to try to confuse you or make you doubt what you remember. They might suggest that you made up these stories or that you misunderstood what was happening. I need you to remember that what happened to you was real, and your job is simply to tell the truth as clearly as you can." The courtroom was packed with more people than I had ever seen in one place. There were journalists from newspapers across Pennsylvania, social workers, police officers, and members of the community who had come to witness what many were calling the trial of the decade for our small corner of the state. The attention felt overwhelming, but Mrs. Hendricks squeezed my hand and whispered, "Just look at me if you get scared. I'll be right here the whole time." Raymond sat at the defendant's table in a clean suit, his hair neatly combed, looking nothing like the predator who had invaded my bedroom night after night. His lawyer, James Morrison, was a well-dressed man from Pittsburgh who specialized in defending clients accused of crimes against children. He had a reputation for aggressive tactics and victim intimidation that made me nervous just looking at him. Marcus was being tried separately, a decision the prosecution had made to prevent the 2 men from coordinating their defense strategies. His trial would follow immediately after Raymond's, meaning I would have to testify twice and relive my nightmare in public not once, but twice. When my name was called, My legs felt like water as I walked to the witness stand. The bailiff, a grandfatherly man named Officer Pete Kowalski, helped me into the chair and adjusted the microphone so I could be heard clearly. Judge Margaret Thompson, one of the few female judges in Pennsylvania at the time, smiled at me encouragingly. "Rose," Judge Thompson said in a warm voice, "take your time with your answers. If you need a break at any point, just let me know. Everyone here wants to make sure you feel comfortable telling your story." District Attorney O'Connor began with simple questions about my life before Raymond entered our family. I talked about my father, my mother, our happy home before everything changed. As I spoke, I could see several jury members wiping away tears, particularly when I described how my father used to braid my hair and sing silly songs. Then came the difficult part. O'Connor guided me through the timeline of abuse, starting with Raymond's arrival and his gradual escalation of inappropriate behavior. I testified about the bathroom incidents, the bedroom violations, the threats and manipulation he had used to keep me silent. My voice shook as I described the terror I had lived with every day, never knowing when he might decide to hurt me again. "Rose," O'Connor said gently, "I need to ask you about the photographs. Can you tell the court what happened when Raymond and Marcus took pictures?" This was one of the hardest parts of my testimony. Through tears, I explained how they had forced me to pose for degrading photographs, how they had used these images to threaten me, how they had told me no one would believe me if I tried to tell the truth because the pictures made me look like a willing participant. When it came time for cross-examination, Defense Attorney Morrison stood up with a predatory smile that reminded me uncomfortably of his client. His strategy became clear immediately. He was going to try to paint me as a disturbed child who had fabricated these stories for attention. "Rose," he began in a voice that sounded sympathetic but felt threatening. "You've been through a lot of changes in your young life, haven't you? You lost your father, your mother remarried, you had to adjust to a new family structure. That must have been very confusing for a little girl." I answered honestly that yes, it had been confusing, but I could see where he was leading. He spent the next hour trying to suggest that I had misinterpreted normal stepfather behavior, that I had been jealous of my mother's new marriage, that I had perhaps even dreamed some of the incidents I described. "Isn't it possible," Morrison suggested with false kindness, "that you were so upset about your father's death and your mother's remarriage that you began to imagine things that weren't really happening?" This was the moment District Attorney O'Connor had prepared me for. I looked directly at Morrison and said in the clearest voice I could manage, "I know the difference between real and pretend. What Raymond did to me was real. It hurt real. The pictures are real. I didn't imagine any of it." But Morrison wasn't finished. In a move that shocked everyone in the courtroom, he produced a letter that my mother had written to Raymond in jail. In it, Catherine expressed her continued love and support, her belief in his innocence, and her conviction that I was either lying or confused. "Your own mother doesn't believe your story, does she, Rose?" Morrison asked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "If what you're saying really happened, wouldn't your mother believe you?" The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. To have my mother's disbelief used as evidence against me in open court felt like being victimized all over again. But before I could crumble under the weight of that betrayal, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Hendricks stood up in the gallery and spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. "That child's mother is a broken woman who can't face the truth because it would destroy the fantasy she's built to survive. But this little girl is a hero who had the courage to tell the truth, even when the adults who should have protected her failed." Judge Thompson gavelled for order, but the damage to Morrison's strategy was already done. The jury had seen a roomful of people rally around me, while my own mother's betrayal only highlighted how isolated and vulnerable I had been. The most damaging evidence came when Detective Hendricks took the stand and revealed information that even I hadn't known. The investigation had uncovered that Raymond and Marcus were part of a larger network of predators who shared children and traded photographs across state lines. The pictures taken of me had been found in the possession of men in Ohio, West Virginia, and Michigan. The defendants weren't just abusing this child for their own gratification, Detective Hendricks testified. They were part of an organized operation that commodified child sexual abuse. Rose was merchandise to them, nothing more. Even more shocking was the revelation that my mother might have known more than she admitted. Phone records showed multiple calls between Catherine and Raymond after his arrest, and investigators had found drafts of letters in our house where she discussed keeping Rose quiet and managing the situation. We believe Mrs. Mitchell may have been willfully blind to the abuse, Detective Hendricks continued. Our investigation suggests she may have suspected what was happening, but chose to prioritize her financial security over her daughter's safety. This testimony devastated any remaining sympathy the jury might have had for my mother's position. The idea that she might have known about the abuse and allowed it to continue made her complicity clear, even if she wasn't criminally charged. The prosecution's case was further strengthened when Marcus's ex-wife, Linda Mitchell, traveled from Ohio to testify. She revealed that Marcus had been suspected of abusing their own daughter before their divorce, and that she had left him specifically to protect their child. Marcus has a pattern, Linda testified, her voice shaking with emotion. He targets families where the mother is vulnerable, widowed, divorced, struggling financially. He presents himself as a helper, a provider, but really he's hunting for access to children. She also testified that Raymond had visited their home several times over the years and that she had observed inappropriate interest in children from both brothers. They would make comments about young girls, rate them, discuss which ones they found attractive. I thought it was just crude talk, but now I realize they were planning. The trial lasted 2 weeks, with witness after witness painting a picture of systematic, premeditated child abuse. Medical experts testified about my injuries, psychological experts explained the impact of trauma on children, and law enforcement detailed the evidence they had collected. When the jury returned after only 3 hours of deliberation, their faces were grim but determined. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman announced, and Raymond's face went white as the reality of his situation finally hit him. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week, but before we left the courthouse that day, District Attorney O'Connor pulled Mrs. Hendricks and me aside for a private conversation. "Rose," he said, "there's something else we need to discuss. During our investigation, we discovered that Raymond and Marcus have been doing this for a long time in multiple states. The FBI wants to talk to you about other children who might be victims. Would you be willing to help us find them?" Standing there in that courthouse hallway, still shaking from my testimony, I realized that my ordeal wasn't over. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had power instead of just pain. I could use my experience to help other children who were trapped in the same hell I had escaped. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "I want to help them." Working with the FBI opened my eyes to horrors I never could have imagined existed beyond my own experience. Special Agent Diana Foster was assigned as my primary contact, a woman in her 30s who had dedicated her career to dismantling child exploitation networks. She had kind but determined eyes and a way of speaking to me that made me feel like a valuable partner in the investigation rather than just another victim. "Rose," Agent Foster explained during our first meeting at the FBI field office in Pittsburgh, "what Raymond and Marcus did to you was part of something much bigger. We've been tracking this network for 3 years, and your case has given us the breakthrough we needed. The photographs we found in their possession have led us to victims in 7 different states. The scope of their operation was staggering. Raymond and Marcus weren't just opportunistic predators. They were part of an organized ring that had been operating since the early 1950s. They would identify vulnerable families, usually headed by single mothers struggling financially, and systematically infiltrate their lives. Once they gained access to children, they would document their crimes and trade the evidence with other predators across the country. We've identified at least 23 children who were victimized by this network, Agent Foster continued, showing me a map with pins marking locations across the Midwest and Northeast. Some of these children are now adults, and many don't even know that photographs of their abuse are still being circulated. We need their testimony to build cases against the other members of this ring. My role in the investigation was both simple and profound, because I was the only victim who had successfully testified and secured convictions. The FBI wanted me to help convince other survivors to come forward. Many of them were still trapped in situations where they couldn't speak out, or they were adults who had buried their trauma so deeply they couldn't bear to relive it. The first child I helped was a 10-year-old girl named Amy Patterson, no relation despite the shared surname, who lived in Cleveland, Ohio. Her situation was eerily similar to mine: a widowed mother, a stepfather who seemed too good to be true, and an uncle who visited frequently. The difference was that Amy's case was discovered before the worst abuse occurred, thanks to the evidence we had provided about the network's methods. Agent Foster arranged for me to speak with Amy by telephone while she was in protective custody. "Amy," I said, my voice shaking with nervousness and determination, "I know you're scared. I know you think no one will believe you. But I'm 8 years old, just like you, and I told the truth about what happened to me. The grown-ups believed me, and they'll believe you too." Amy's case led to the arrests of 2 more members of the network and the rescue of 3 other children who had been targeted but not yet abused. Watching those families being protected because of my willingness to speak out gave me a sense of purpose I had never experienced before. Over the next 6 months, I worked with the FBI to help locate and support 12 other child victims. Each conversation was difficult, forcing me to relive my own trauma while trying to give courage to children who were still trapped in theirs. But with each successful case, I felt stronger, more confident that my terrible experience could serve a greater purpose. The healing process was neither linear nor simple. Mrs. Wilkes, my counselor, continued to work with me twice a week, helping me process not just the original abuse, but also the complex emotions that came with my new role as a survivor advocate. Some days I felt empowered and strong. Other days I was overwhelmed by nightmares and flashbacks that made it difficult to function. "Healing isn't about forgetting what happened to you, Rose," Mrs. Wilkes explained during one of our sessions. "It's about learning to carry those experiences without letting them control your life. You're already showing remarkable resilience by choosing to help other children, but you also need to give yourself permission to just be a little girl sometimes." Living with Mrs. Hendricks provided the stable, loving environment I needed to do that healing work. She had officially become my legal guardian after my mother's rights were terminated due to her continued relationship with Raymond and her refusal to prioritize my safety. The court hearing where this decision was made was brief but heartbreaking. My mother attended and begged for one more chance, but Judge Thompson was firm in her decision. "Mrs. Mitchell," the judge had said, "you have consistently chosen to support your daughter's abuser over your daughter herself. Until you can demonstrate that you understand the gravity of what occurred and show genuine commitment to Rose's well-being, this court cannot consider reunification." My mother left the courthouse that day, and I didn't see her again for many years. The finality of that loss was devastating in its own way, but it also freed me from the constant hope and disappointment that had defined our relationship since Raymond's arrest. Mrs. Hendricks filled that maternal void with patience, wisdom, and unconditional love. She never tried to replace my original mother, but she provided something even more valuable: security. I knew that no matter what happened, no matter how difficult my healing journey became, she would be there. "Rose," she told me one evening, as we worked together in her garden, planting flowers for the spring, "family isn't just about blood relations. It's about people who choose to love and protect each other. I chose you, and I'm honored that you've chosen me back." The house across, The street, my original home, sat empty for months after the arrests. My mother had been unable to maintain the mortgage payments without Raymond's income, and the house had been foreclosed upon. Sometimes I would see her drive by slowly, looking at both houses with an expression I couldn't interpret. Mrs. Hendricks always made sure I was inside during those visits, understanding that seeing my mother's continued anguish might set back my progress. School became both a refuge and a challenge. Returning to third grade after everything that had happened felt surreal. My classmates knew something significant had occurred. The trial had been front-page news in our small town, but they didn't understand the details. Some children were kind and protective. Others were curious in ways that felt invasive. My teacher, Mrs. Rachel Coleman, was a godsend. She had been briefed by the school counselor about my situation and worked to create an environment where I could succeed academically while having space to process my experiences. She never drew attention to my absences for FBI meetings or counseling sessions, and she quietly intervened when other children asked inappropriate questions. Rose has been through something very difficult, I once heard her tell a particularly persistent classmate. The best way we can help her is by being good friends and letting her share what she wants to share when she's ready. My academic performance actually improved dramatically once I felt safe. Without the constant fear and hypervigilance that had defined my life during the abuse, I was able to focus on learning in ways I never had before. I discovered I had a particular aptitude for reading and writing, losing myself in books that transported me to worlds where children were protected and justice always prevailed. The sentencing hearings for Raymond and Marcus took place in November 1959, almost 4 months after their convictions. Both men received the maximum sentences possible under Pennsylvania law at the time. Raymond was sentenced to 25 years in prison, and Marcus received 30 years due to his longer history of offenses and the violence of his crimes. I attended both sentencing hearings, not because I was required to, but because I wanted to look them in the eyes one final time as a survivor rather than a victim. When Judge Thompson announced Raymond's sentence, he turned to look at me with an expression of pure hatred. But instead of feeling afraid, I felt something I had never experienced before when facing him. Pity. "You can't hurt me anymore," I whispered, knowing he couldn't hear me but needing to say the words anyway. "And because of what you did to me, you'll never hurt anyone else either." Agent Foster attended the sentencing and spoke with me afterward about the broader impact of our work together. "Rose, because of your courage, we've now arrested 17 members of this network across 8 states. We've rescued 42 children from ongoing abuse situations and provided evidence that's led to the conviction of predators who might have operated with impunity for decades." The numbers were staggering, but what meant more to me were the individual stories. Amy Patterson, the first child I had spoken with, sent me a drawing she had made showing 2 little girls holding hands under a rainbow. At the bottom, she had, written in careful cursive, "Thank you for helping me be brave." By my 9th birthday in March 1960, I had found something I never expected to discover after such trauma: a sense of mission. I knew that my future would somehow involve protecting children, seeking justice for the innocent, and using my experience to make the world a little bit safer for the vulnerable. Mrs. Hendricks recognized this calling before I fully understood it myself. "You have a gift, Rose," she told me one evening as we read together in her living room. "You've been through the worst kind of pain, but instead of letting it destroy you, you're using it to help others. That's the mark of someone very special." As I sat in that warm, safe living room, surrounded by books and love and the promise of a future I could choose for myself, I realized that my story wasn't defined by what had been done to me. It was defined by what I had chosen to do with those experiences. The little girl who had once been trapped in a house of horrors was becoming someone who could storm the gates of hell itself to rescue other children. And that transformation? I was beginning to understand was just the beginning of a much larger journey. The years that followed my work with the FBI shaped me in ways I'm still discovering today, as I sit here in my living room in Asheville, 64 years later. The little girl who testified in that courthouse grew up to become exactly what she promised herself she would be: a protector of children, a seeker of justice, and living proof that the worst experiences can be transformed into the greatest purposes. High school brought new challenges as I continued to process my trauma while building a life that honored both my past and my future. By age 16, I had grown into a confident young woman who understood that her scars were not marks of shame, but badges of survival. Mrs. Hendricks, who had formally adopted me when I turned 12, encouraged my academic pursuits and my continued involvement in child advocacy work. "Rose," she would say as I struggled with calculus homework or worried about college applications, "you've already proven you can handle anything life throws at you. These challenges are just stepping stones to the work you're meant to do." I graduated as valedictorian of Millfield High School in 1969, delivering a commencement address that drew standing ovations and tears from the entire auditorium. I spoke about resilience, about the power of community support, and about the responsibility we all have to protect the vulnerable. In the audience, Agent Foster, who had become a lifelong mentor, beamed with pride alongside Mrs. Hendricks. College at Penn State was where I first declared my major in social work, with a minor in criminal justice. I wanted to understand both the psychological aspects of trauma and the legal mechanisms for achieving justice. My professors quickly recognized my unique combination of academic ability and real-world experience, often inviting me to share my perspectives in classes about child welfare and victim advocacy. During my sophomore year, I met David Robertson, a pre-law student who was volunteering with the campus crisis hotline. David was different from other young men I had known: patient, respectful, and genuinely interested in social justice rather than personal gain. Our friendship developed slowly, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than romantic attraction. "I admire what you're doing," he told me during one of our late-night study sessions in the library. "Using your experience to help others takes incredible strength. I hope someday I can make a difference the way you already have." David became my closest friend, then my boyfriend, and eventually my husband in a small ceremony in 1974, 3 years after we graduated. Mrs. Hendricks walked me down the aisle, her eyes shining with pride and joy. The wedding was attended by many of the people who had supported my journey: Agent Foster, Mrs. Wilkes, Detective Robert Hendricks, and several of the survivors I had helped over the years. Our marriage was built on a foundation of complete honesty about my past and shared commitment to building a future focused on protecting children. David had gone to law school and specialized in family law, while I pursued my master's degree in social work and began working for the Pennsylvania Department of Children and Families. The 1970s and 1980s were transformative decades for child protection work. New laws were passed, mandatory reporting requirements were established, and society began to acknowledge that child abuse was far more common than anyone had wanted to admit. I found myself frequently called upon to testify before legislative committees, train social workers, and develop protocols for interviewing child victims. My own children, twin daughters Rebecca and Sarah, born in 1976, grew up understanding that their mother had survived something terrible, but had used that experience to help other children. They were never burdened with the details until they were old enough to understand. But they always knew that our family's mission was to make the world safer for vulnerable children. "Mommy," Rebecca once asked when she was 7 years old, "why do you go to work to talk to sad children?" "Because," I explained, kneeling down to her level, "sometimes children need grown-ups who understand what it feels like to be scared. I help them feel safe again." The girls became my greatest teachers about normal childhood development and healthy family relationships. Watching them grow up secure, confident, and protected helped heal parts of my own inner child that I hadn't even realized were still wounded. In 1985, I was appointed as the first director of Pennsylvania's new Child Advocacy Center program, a role that allowed me to design systems specifically focused on minimizing trauma for child victims during the investigation and prosecution process. The centers I helped establish became models that were replicated across the country. One of my proudest achievements was the development of specialized interview techniques that allowed children to tell their stories without being re-traumatized, by repeated questioning from multiple agencies. Drawing on my own experience of testifying as a young child, I created protocols that prioritized the emotional well-being of victims while still gathering the evidence needed for successful prosecutions. The work wasn't always easy. There were cases that brought back memories of my own trauma. Nights when I would wake up in cold sweats after interviewing children whose experiences mirrored my own. But David was always there to hold me through. The flashbacks and my daughter's laughter echoing through our house reminded me daily of what healthy childhoods looked like. In 1992, nearly 33 years after Raymond and Marcus were sentenced, I received a phone call that I had been both expecting and dreading. Raymond had died in prison of a heart attack. He was 68 years old and had served his full sentence, never showing remorse or acknowledging the harm he had caused. Marcus lived until 1998, dying of liver failure at age 72. When I learned of his death, I felt neither celebration nor grief, just a quiet sense of closure. The men who had stolen my childhood were gone, but the work they had inadvertently inspired me to do continued. My mother, Catherine, had remarried again in 1965 to a decent man named Frank Williams, who helped her finally confront the truth about what had happened to me. In 1995, she reached out through an intermediary to ask if we could meet. She was 69 years old, widowed again, and according to the message she sent, desperate to make amends for her failures as a mother. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a restaurant in Harrisburg, with David by my side for support. The woman who walked in was elderly, frail, and bore little resemblance to the vibrant librarian who had once read me fairy tales. Her first words were the ones I had waited 36 years to hear. "Rose, I was wrong. I was so terribly, horribly wrong. I chose my own comfort over your safety, and I will never forgive myself for that. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that I finally understand what I did to you." The conversation lasted 3 hours. She told me about the years of therapy she had undergone, the painful process of accepting that she had been willfully blind to my abuse, and her attempts to make amends by volunteering with organizations that supported single mothers and their children. "I can't undo what I failed to do," she said through tears. "But I've spent the last 20 years trying to prevent other mothers from making the same terrible choices I made. I chose to forgive her, not because she deserved it, but because carrying that anger was no longer serving me." We maintained a careful relationship until her death in 2001, meeting occasionally for lunch and sharing updates about my daughters, her step-grandchildren she had never really known. As I moved into my 50s and 60s, my role evolved from direct service to policy advocacy and training. I wrote 2 books about child protection, testified before Congress multiple times, and helped establish national standards for child advocacy centers. The little girl who had once felt powerless against 2 predators had become someone whose voice carried weight in the highest levels of government. But perhaps my greatest achievement was something much simpler: raising 2 daughters who grew up to become advocates themselves. Rebecca became a pediatrician specializing in child abuse cases, and Sarah followed in David's footsteps as a family law attorney. Together, our family has continued the work that began with my testimony in that Jefferson County courthouse all those years ago. Now, at 73, I spend my days in this beautiful house in Asheville, surrounded by photos of my children and grandchildren, my awards and recognitions, and the letters from survivors who credit me with helping them find their voices. But what brings me the greatest joy are the pictures on my mantle showing healthy, happy children, some of them the biological or adopted children of survivors I helped decades ago. The cycle of abuse that claimed my childhood ended with me. It did not pass to my daughters or their children. Instead, our family became a source of healing and protection for countless others. Every morning, when I wake up in my safe, comfortable bed, I remember that little 8-year-old girl who thought she would never escape the nightmare she was living. I remember her courage in unlocking that door for the police, her bravery in testifying against her abusers, and her determination to use her pain to help others. That little girl grew up to become me, Grandma Rose, survivor, advocate, and living proof that no matter how dark the night may seem, dawn always comes for those who refuse to give up hope. My dear viewers, if you are that frightened child today, if you are trapped in circumstances that seem impossible to escape, please know that you are stronger than you realize. Your voice matters. Your story has power. And there are people in this world who will believe you, support you, and help you transform your pain into purpose. The little girl who was once told she was powerless grew up to help pass laws, save children, and build a legacy of protection that will outlive her. If she could do it, so can you. Your story doesn't end with what was done to you. It begins with what you choose to do next. And that, my precious viewers, is the greatest truth I can share with you today. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.